Good day. Welcome to the discussion of the shareholders' equity part 4. Okay, so the objective of this presentation is to discuss the topics about dividends as well as appropriation of retained earnings. Let's talk about dividends in totality. So dividends are distribution to shareholders of corporate earnings in proportion to the number of shares held by them. Distribution may take form of cash, non-cash assets, notes or other evidence of corporate indebtedness, and shares of company's own stock. The power to declare dividend is vested upon the board of directors, although they have to observe legal requirements governing the maintenance of legal and stated capital. Dividends are given only to those outstanding shares. So kung maalala ninyo on the previous presentations, that outstanding shares are those shares that are on the hand of the shareholders. So it may be equal to the issued shares, or our outstanding shares is equal to our um, issued shares minus treasury shares. So throughout this discussion, we will be talking about examples of dividends and how do we account it for in terms of entries. There are three important dates to be considered in terms of dividends. So you have the date of declaration, date of record, and date of distribution or payment. So let's talk about briefly what are these three important dates. Okay, so the first one is the date of declaration. So our date of declaration is the date when the board of directors formally declares and announces the dividend. Okay? A reduction in retained earnings is recorded on this date. Okay? That's the time where the board of director announces that there would be dividend given. Okay? So may entry tayo dyan. Again, it states here that there is a reduction in retained earnings at this date. Okay? So the next important date about dividends is the date of record. So in the date of record, okay, this is the date when the company determines the shareholders who are entitled to the receipt of the declared dividends. So, kanina sa date of declaration, nagdeklara tayo na magbibigay tayo ng dividends, no? We also know kanina din on the previous slides presentation, now we have to declare on the outstanding shares. So, alam natin yung totality ng outstanding shares, kaya we can have the entry on the date of declaration. Samantalang sa date of record, as mentioned, no, it is only a date where we identify sino ba yung mga mabibigyan. And in this case, no entry is required. However, a list of registered shareholders is made as of the close of this business on this date. So, ang ginagawa lang dito is nagpo-provide lang tayo ng list. So, there is no formal entry on the date of record. Okay? So, the last important dates in terms of dividends is the date of payment or date of distribution. So, this is the date when the dividends declared are paid or distributed to shareholders. Okay, an entry is made on the books to record the settlement, either the payment of cash, okay, or by distribution of the assets, o kaya naman company's own shares. So, technically, as you can see in these three important dates, dalawa lang po yung merong journal entries. One is on the date of declaration to reduce the retained earnings, and then another would be on the date of payment. So, wala tayo makikita later na any entries related to date of record. We have various forms of dividends. So we have cash dividends, scrip dividends, property dividends, share dividends or bonus issue, and liquidating dividends. So we will be discussing this one by one and give examples and related entries to them. For our first type of dividend, okay, so we have the cash dividends. So cash dividends are distribution to the owners that are distributable in the form of cash. So this is typically expressed either in peso amount per share or percentage of par value. Okay? So in terms of peso amount natin, okay, per share, so parang ganito yan, peso amount per share. Okay, let's say for example, we have 10,000 shares. Tapos sabihin ng board of directors kapag nagdeklara, okay, bigyan ng tigli 5 pisong dividendo itong mga shareholders na to. So, in that case, what was being declared is a peso amount per share na cash dividend. On the other hand, okay, we have the percentage of par value. So, mamaya makikita natin yan in terms of preference share. So, parang ganito yan, okay? So, meron tayong 10% preference share capital, okay? So, ang mangyayari, yung 10% na indicated on the preference share, multiplied it with the share capital. So, yun ho yung magiging cash dividends natin. Okay? Declared for those outstanding shares. So, that's cash dividends, no? How we compute for it. Now, in terms of the entries related to cash dividends, so on the date of declaration, as mentioned in the theoretical discussion a while ago, no, it's the date wherein we reduce the retained earnings. So we simply debit, no, retained earnings and credit a cash dividends payable. So yes, we will have a payable since on the date of declaration, hindi pa naman ho tayo nagbayad ng dividendo. Okay? So kung magkano yung amount niyan, yun yung nakabase kanina sa sinabi kong discussion ng peso amount per share or as a percentage of par value. Okay? So, itong cash dividends payable na to, if ever na hindi pa siya mabayaran at the end of the accounting period, this will be considered as a current liability. Okay? So, on the other hand, wala tayong entry ng date of record. Nabanggit ko na kanina yon, no? And our last entry would be related to the date of payment wherein we pay, no? Yung cash dividends natin. So, ang entry mo would be debit cash dividends payable and credit ka ng cash. So, that's how we express the cash dividends in terms of entries. So, take note ha, importante yung magiging computations natin dito. Kasi nga, kahit alam mo itong mga pro forma entries na to, no, but if you don't know where does the amount came from, no, wala tayong magagawa. Okay? So, again, compute. So, let's give an example about cash dividend. So, ang bibigay ko lang muna ngayon is all about peso dividend. Okay? Yung peso amount per share. Pero later, no, meron tayong magiging example about percentage of par value. Okay? So let's have Spam Corporation has 10,000 shares of 100,000 par value ordinary share capital outstanding as of April 1, 2020. On this date, the board of directors declared a cash dividend of 10 peso per share. So 10 peso per share yung magiging cash dividend natin. Okay? To shareholders of record on April 15, 2020, payable on April 30, 2020. Okay, so kung susundan natin, April 1 was the date of declaration. So on the date of declaration, again, we reduce the retained earnings. So we debit retained earnings, okay, which is 10,000 shares times, okay, 10 peso, kasi 10 peso dividend yung binigay. So we have 100,000 and we credit cash dividends payable na 100,000. Okay, the date of record is April 15. So again, no entry on that date. And last would be on April 30, 2020, which is the date of payment. Okay, so we debit cash dividends payable na 100,000 and credit to cash. So that's how we account for and record for the cash dividend. The next form of dividend is a scrip dividend. So scrip dividend are in fact, no, a deferred cash dividends. So scrip dividend is declared when the corporation has sufficient retained earnings balance but not sufficient funds at the time for the cash dividends. So kanina sa cash dividend natin, we have enough retained earnings as well as we have enough cash, no, to pay for that cash dividend. Samantalang, kapag script dividends, okay, we want to declare dividend, may enough time retained earnings, pero wala pa tayong cash na available o kaya naman kulang pa yung cash natin. So what will happen here is we will simply declare script dividends, but later on, it will be paid for cash. So, ano ba yung pwede natin declared as script dividends? So, pwede tayong mag-issue actually ng any notes o kaya naman other evidences of corporate indebtedness. Pero yung typical would be notes, no? And since this is notes, of course, we will be paying the shareholders of interest. Kanina sa cash dividends, walang interest kasi nga, most likely, bayad agad sila. There is an available cash. Pero dito, it will take a long time or it will take a period of time before we can pay for the cash dividend. So, we are putting up an interest on it. Okay? So, sa sequence natin ng entries, okay, again, we have entries for date of declaration at saka date of payment. Madadagdagan lang tayo dito just in case if this dividends does not coincide, no, in the payment of it does not coincide in a year. Okay, so tignan natin yung pro forma entries. So on the date of declaration, again, we debit retained earnings and credit tayo ng script dividends payable. So ano yung computation niyan? Kung ano yung gusto i-deklara ng mga shareholder, whether peso dividend, okay, o kaya naman percentage of par value dividends, okay? Yun lang din yung computation kagaya kanina, pero iba rin title natin, script dividends payable. Although script dividends payable siya, no, it will be presented still as a liability in our balance sheet, okay? So just in case lang, no, na dadaan sa year-end o kaya naman end of accounting period yung ating script dividends, no? Ulitin ko lang, wala tayong date of record na entry, pero kapag dumaan siya sa year-end o kaya naman end of the accounting period, no? We can accrue for the interests, no? So we debit interest expense and credit interest payable. So na-discuss naman na natin on the financial liabilities kung paano tayo mag-interest about notes. So it's the same with this case. Okay? And also on the date of payment, of course, magbabayad na tayo. So hindi lang natin babayaran kung magkano yung declared na script dividends, no, but we will also pay for the related interest. Kaya ang pro forma entry natin would be debit script dividends payable, no? Debit as well interest expense or interest payable in the case may be, and credit cash. So let's have an example about script dividends. So we have Corned Beef Corporation, which has a 10,000 shares of 100 par value ordinary share capital outstanding as of October 31, 2019. On this date, no, the board of directors declared a cash dividend of 10 peso per share to shareholders of record on November 30, 2019. Okay? Promissory note dated December 1 were issued, okay, on that date. So it's technically saying na yes, they are declaring 10 peso dividend, pero dahil wala pa silang enough cash to pay it, they are issuing a promissory note. Okay, the note matures within 6 months plus interest of 12% per annum. So yes, the notes will take 6 months to mature. Pero it doesn't necessarily mean na hindi tayo pwedeng magbayad agad-agad if we have already cash on hand, no? So, pwedeng mas maikse o kaya pwedeng abutin ng 6 months basta the maturity of the notes is 6 months, okay? And having a 12% per annum interest. So, the corporation paid its shareholders on March 31, 2020. Okay, so let's start with the date of declaration. So sa date of declaration, again, you have 10,000 outstanding shares multiplied by 10 pesos. So the totality of the dividends to be paid, okay, or to be declared would be 100,000. So we debit retained earnings, 100,000, and credit script dividends payable, 100,000. Okay? So since ang date of record ulit walang entry, and then the date of payment as indicated in the problem will be on March 31, okay, dadaan tayo sa year-end. So magkakaroon tayo ng year-end accrual of interest. So it's just a typical adjusting entry for interest. So for our interest to be computed, so may 100,000 tayong utang multiplied by 12% interest rate, no, times 1/12. So, bakit 1/12? Kasi na-issue naman yung notes lang ng December 1. So, December 1 up to December 31, 1 month. So, our accrual of interest is equal to 1,000 pesos. So, we debit interest expense, 1,000 pesos, and credit interest payable of 1,000. So, dalawa na yung ating liabilities, no? Our scrip dividends payable, 100,000, as well as the interest payable of 1,000. Okay? So for our last entry, no, which is on the date of payment na mangyayari on March 31, so we will pay already all, no? Yung cash dividend supposed to be plus the related interests. Okay? So we debit scrip dividends payable na 100,000. Then we debit the interest payable, yung inaccrue natin on December 31 na 1,000. And then since okay, from January 1, 2020 up to March 31, 2020, tumakbo ulit yung ating notes. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, we need to also recognize related interest expense on it. Kaya may debit tayo ng interest expense na 3,000 pesos. So, how did we compute for the 3,000? So, 100,000 times the 12% times 3/12. So, yung 3/12 natin came from the January 1 up to March 31 na computation. Okay? So, the totality of the cash to be credited na babayaran natin should be 104,000. So now, see the difference between the cash dividends compared with the scrip dividends, no? Meron tayong related interest component as to scrip dividends. So any question? So next form of dividend is property dividends, no? So dividends distributable in form of non-cash assets are known as property dividends. So this type of dividend reduces retained earning at the cost or the carrying value of the property on the date of declaration. So property distributed may take the form of asset that can be easily divided or allocated among the shareholders, such as yung stocks of other companies owned corporation. Okay? So, pwede pong mangyari na parang equity or debt security. So, in your intermediate accounting 1, you have discussed about um, equity and debt investments. So, these investments could be considered as also form part of this property dividend to be distributed kasi mas madali siyang hatiin compared with declaring a land, no? Ano mangyayari doon sa land, no? So you cannot easily proportion it, no? Under IFRIC, okay? 17 entitled Distribution of Non-Cash Assets, the liability for property dividends is measured at fair value of the assets to be distributed. So, i-record natin yung asset to be distributed at its fair value. So, at the end of the reporting period and at the date of settlement, the carrying amount of the dividend payable is adjusted to fair value of the assets to be distributed. Okay? So, later, we will have pro forma entries, no? Related to the property dividends. So ang point dito is that since we're talking about property dividends, an example of which are equity investments or even debt investments, which are somehow in your previous discussions sa intermediate, no, they are somehow either at fair value recording. Okay, so we need to update them and be recorded at fair value. So madadagdagan lang din ulit yung typical na sequence ng entries natin because of the fair value adjustments. So let's discuss about the pro forma entries of a property dividend. So on the date of declaration, whenever you need to declare a property dividend, you need to check, no? Magkano ba yung carrying value or yung cost na naka-record related to that property, no? So kasi ang sabi natin kanina based on IFRIC 17, we need to record it at fair value. So ang gagawin muna natin at the date of declaration before tayo mag-entry, okay, is to update first the fair value. Eh sir, paano yan kung hindi po nagbago yung fair value at saka cost? So wala tayong mangyayaring update. But just in case, no, that we have to update the value of this property, okay, gagamitin ko equity investment, pero it could also be debt investment or other assets, no, that could be revalued, no? So we debit equity investment at fair value. So bakit tayo nag-debit? Because my presumption here is to increase, okay? And we credit unrealized gains on equity investment. Okay, so this is to increase the fair value. So naalala niyo na, di ba? May unrealized gains or losses tayo kapag equity investment or even debt investment at fair value. Okay, so paano naman kapag nag-decrease? So kabaliktaran. So we will debit unrealized loss or unrealized gains or losses, naka-debit, no? And credit tayo ng equity or debt investment. Okay, so naalala niyo na. Okay? Doon sa Intac 1. Okay. So, after mong i-update yung fair value ng property to be distributed, ayan, mag-entry na tayo ngayon para sa date of declaration natin mismo. So, we debit the retained earnings. So, magkano yung retained earnings na i-debit? That should be equal doon sa fair value of the declared property. Okay? Kaya natin in-update yung kanina kasi kailangan natin yung fair value to be recorded. So, yun yung retained earnings to be debited. And we credit property dividends payable, okay? Or in other books discussion, property dividends distributable. Okay? So, yan yung magiging entry natin on the date of declaration. Okay? Again, there will be no entry on the date of record. Okay, so singit ko lang, no? So after mong madeklara yung dividend, property dividends, and just in case na ang payment nito is for the next accounting period pa, of course, dadaan yung year-end, no? O kaya naman yung end of accounting period natin. So ang mangyari, if ever na meron tayong ganong scenario na mas tagal pa yung pagbabayad next accounting period pa, let's say 2019 dineklara yung property dividends, tapos 2020 pa babayaran, dadaan tayo ng December 31 year-end adjustments. So in the year-end adjustment, no, the same entries na binigay natin kanina sa date of declaration will be recorded. Okay? So, as simple as that. Now, to continue with the date of settlement, so babayaran na natin ngayon yung ating property dividend. So, on the date of settlement, okay, the fair value can also decrease or increase. So, ang mangyayari lang ngayon, on the date of payment, ito, no? So, kung magkano yung totality ng retained earnings na meron mula doon sa declaration ng, So, kung magkano yung increase, let's say, for example, tumaas ulit, no? So, from the previous, from 10 pesos siya, naging 12 siya on the date of payment. So, ang mangyayari, hindi na tayo magkakaroon ng update ng unrealized kasi i-dispose na natin eh. So, ang mangyayari lang, i-update lang natin ngayon yung retained earnings lang at saka yung property dividends muna. So, from my example, no, from 10 peso naging 12, so mag-i-increase ng 2 pesos. So, kumbaga, pag in-entryhan mo dito at the date of payment, you debit, again, retained earnings by 2 pesos dahil dun sa increase and credit ka ng property dividends payable. So, ngayon, ang tanong, magkano na yung totality ng property dividends payable mo? Diba 12? Yun yung sinabi ko kanina. Now, yung 12 pesos na yun yung babayaran natin. So, magiging entry natin ngayon would be debit property dividends payable, kung magkano na yung updated value ng property dividends payable, and we credit the equity investment or kung ano man yung investment na in-entry natin, and we credit also gain on disposal. Sir, bakit gain on disposal? Kasi yung property dividends payable natin is doon sa nabanggit kong example kanina is 12, no? Tapos yung equity investment mo, updated value niya is 10 pesos lang. So kaya nagkaroon ng difference na 2 pesos, which is the gain. Ngayon, itong sinasabi kong to, i-apply natin mamaya sa mga examples so that you can easily understood. So I know na nako-confuse pa kayo bakit ganito yung pro forma entries natin, pero later on our examples, let's try to check bakit nga ba ganyan yung naging entries. Okay, so para malinawan tayo dun sa discussion ng property dividends, so let's discuss two scenario problems, no? So mayroon akong dalawang examples dito. So let's have the first one. So Sweet Corn Corporation has 10,000 shares of 100 par value ordinary share capital outstanding as of April 1, 2020. On this date, the Board of Directors declared a property dividend to shareholders of record on April 15, 2020, payable on April 30, 2020. The company will distribute 5 shares. So ito yung property na dinidistribute. 5 share of Potato Corporation. So sino si Potato Corporation? Si Sweet Corn, meron siyang investment kay Potato Corporation. So yung each outstanding ordinary share ni Sweet Corn ay makaka-receive ng 5 share ni Potato Corporation, okay, which is owned by Sweet Corn Corporation. Okay? So each share of potato has a carrying value of 10 peso on the date of declaration. So dito wala tayong problema kasi walang ibang data na binigay about the fair value. So we will assume that the carrying value of 10 pesos at the date of declaration will be now our value for the property or that equity investment. Okay. So on the date of declaration, so we have to debit retained earnings. So again, 10,000 yung outstanding ordinary share na makaka-receive ng 5, so times 5, multiplied by 10 peso, which is yung carrying value at the date of declaration. So yung value ng dineclared nating property is 500,000. So yun yung magiging reduction natin sa retained earnings. Okay? And we credit property dividends payable of 500,000. Okay? So that's for the date of declaration. Now, wala ulit date of record na entry. Okay? But on April 30, 2020, on the date of payment, so we will already distribute yung ating shares kay Potato to the shareholders. So what will happen is we will be debiting the property dividends payable na 500,000 and credit tayo ng investment in Potato Corporation stock. So hindi ko naman specify kung ano investment, whether ano to, fair value, kaya associate. So depende, di ba? Naalala ninyo in our equity discussions in TAC 1, meron tayo equity at fair value, investment in associate, or even investment in subsidiaries. Okay? So nilagay ko na lang dito general investment in Potato Corporation stock. Okay? So yan yung simpleng property dividend example. So let's try to look on another example. Any question? Okay, so let's check on this another example for property dividends. So declared property dividends, okay, which is an equity investment at fair value to profit or loss to ordinary shareholders, no? The investment had a carrying value of 600,000 as of December 31, 2019. So the fair value on May 10, which is the date of declaration, is 720,000 and 736,000 on June 1, 2020, date of distribution. So let's check on this one, okay? So on May 10, 2020, on the date of declaration, as you can see, 720 na dapat yung value niya. Pero magkano yung naka-record na value? 600,000 pa lang. So kagaya nung kanina sa sequence ng theoretical discussion, okay, na entries, so, kailangan muna nating i-update yung value ng equity investment. So, nag-increase siya. So, your equity investment at fair value to profit or loss will be debited by 120,000 and magkikredit tayo ng unrealized gains or loss at fair value through profit or loss also na 120,000. So, saan nanggaling yun? Mula yun sa increase from 720,000 less 600,000 na dati niyang value. So ngayon, okay, after mong i-update yon, saka ka pala magre-record ulit ng entry for the date of declaration na debit retained earnings, okay, yung updated fair value na based on IFRIC 17 kanina, no, na discussion, okay, 720,000, and we credit property dividends payable na 720,000. So at this point in time, makikita mo na ang property dividends payable natin is 720,000. Okay? So, wala tayong adjustment kasi hindi naman siya dumaan sa year-end o kaya naman end of accounting period ng company. So, the next date for the entries would be on June 1, 2020 on the date of payment. So, tumaas ulit yung value niya going to 736,000. So, Again, we update, pero ang update lang natin would fall under the retained earnings. So we debit retained earnings at 16,000 and we credit property dividends payable 16,000. So bakit ulit nabawasan yung retained earnings? It's because we have an increase in the fair value, which is from 720,000 naging 736,000. Okay? At nag-increase din yung payable. But now, on the payment itself, okay, ito na. So we will be debiting the property dividends payable kapag tinignan mo sa sequence ng entries dito sa slide, from 720 na payable, nagdagdag tayo ng 16,000. So totality pa rin 736,000 yung property dividends payable. Okay, and we credit the equity investment at fair value through profit or loss. So makikita mo rin dito sa sequence natin, 600 tayo kanina on December 31, nagdagdag tayo ng May 10 ng 120, kaya 720 yung value ng equity investment. Now, the difference of the property dividend at saka ng equity investment natin is now charged as a gain on disposal of equity investment na 16,000. So, ito yung nagpapakita ng actual picture ng pro forma entries natin kanina. So, yung nasa previous slide, that's also an additional discussion na kung saan hindi nagbago yung fair value. Dito sa slide na to, nagbago yung fair value natin. Okay, so another form of dividend is share dividends or bonus issued. Okay, so this is also called as capitalization issue that distributes an entity's earnings through the issuance of its own share. So let's have a quick recap lang ng mga na-discuss natin kanina. No? So meron tayong cash dividend, pambabayad natin is cash. Scrip dividends, we will going to pay it with cash, but we are issuing notes o kaya naman any liability instruments at meron tayong interest doon. Okay, nababayaran. Also, we have discussed property dividends na we are declaring our property or non-cash asset, okay, to be distributed over the shareholders. Ngayon naman, pag share dividends or bonus issued or capitalization issue na tinatawag natin, yung shares mismo natin, yung ipamimigay as dividends to the stockholders. So, meron tayong dalawang uri ng share dividends or stock dividends or bonus issue. Okay? So when the shares represents less than 20%, okay, mamaya pag-usapan natin yung percentage, no? Pero yung 20% na yon, if less than 20% of outstanding voting shares, okay, yung ating idideklarang dividend, ang tawag natin doon is small stock dividend or small bonus issued. And the amount of the retained earnings to be transferred is equal to the fair value of the shares to be distributed as dividends. So pag small stock dividend, again, less than 20% of the outstanding voting shares, yung dineklara, i-record daw siya at fair value. So mamaya sa entries, makikita natin yung effect ng sinasabi ko na fair value. Okay? And on the other hand, no, if the corporation declares 20% or more of the outstanding voting shares, then okay, it is known now as large stock dividend or large bonus issue. Okay? At ang mangyari doon is the amount of retained earnings to be transferred is equal lang sa par value or the stated value of the shares to be distributed as dividends. So, again, to give you a distinction between these two, kapag small stock dividend, less than 20% yung declaration, i-record siya at fair value. Kapag large stock dividend, okay, it's 20% or more ng voting outstanding shares to be recorded at par value. So ngayon, pag-usapan natin saan nanggaling yung 20%, less than 20%, or more than 20%. Okay. So yung percentage na yon ay makukompute based dito sa okay, quotient ng number of share dividends declared. Okay? So, minsan kasi, percentage na lang yung binibigay. So, wala tayong problema kung percentage na lang. Pero paano kung hindi percentage? So, ganito mag-compute ng percentage. So, yung percentage is equal to the number of share dividends declared all over the total number of outstanding shares. So, parang ganito yan. So, kung meron kang outstanding shares na 10,000 shares, tapos ang dineklara is, let's say, 1,000. So 1,000 over 10,000, that's equal only to 10%. So kung 10% siya, pasok siya dun sa threshold natin na less than 20%, so may tuturing mo siya as small stock dividend. Okay? So pag mas mataas ulit ang percentage, large stock dividend, 20% or more. Okay? So makikita natin mamaya sa mga entries yung effect niya. So let's see the pro forma entries for a small stock dividend. Again, ang small stock dividend will have a less than 20% of the declared dividends over the outstanding shares. Okay, so on the date of declaration, we will be recording it at fair value. So we debit retained earnings at the fair value of the shares being declared. Okay, credit, share dividends distributable. So hindi po liability yan. It is a stockholders equity account. Okay, so i-credit natin yung share dividends distributable na yan at par value. Okay, nung share na na-declare. And then, of course, dahil usually mas mataas yung fair value compared to the par value being declared in terms of a small stock dividends, so yung excess will be charged as share premium. Okay? Clear ba tayo? Okay. So, wala ulit tayong entry on the date of record. Now, on the date of distribution, yung share dividends distributable na na-record kanina at par, okay, will now be transferred to the ordinary share capital, which is also to be credited at par. Okay, so as you can notice, yung ating retained earnings lang ang naka-record at fair value. Pero yung ordinary share capital and share dividends distributable dito is recorded at par value. So this is the pro forma entry of a small stock dividend. So to give you an example about small stock dividends, we have Shopao Corporation has 10,000 shares of 100 par value ordinary share capital outstanding as of December 1, 2019. So on the date, okay, on this date, the Board of Directors declared a 10%. So yan na yung nagsasabi sa atin na it is a small stock dividend kasi 10% lang. Stock dividend distributable to shareholder of record on December 30, 2019 and payable siya on January 15, 2020. So the fair value of Shopao stock at December 1 is 105. Then, on December 30, 110, and on January 15, 106. So, wag kayong malilito sa mga fair values na yan. Kapag small stock dividend, ang papakialaman nyo lang na fair value is the fair value at the date of declaration. So, yung 105 lang ang gagamitin natin dyan. Disregard 110 and 106. Okay. So, on December 1, 2019, the date of declaration, okay, so, we will be debiting retained earnings. Nabanggit ko kanina, it should be recorded at fair value nung dineclare. So, meron tayong 10,000 shares times 10%. Actually, ang madidistribute sa lahat is total of 1,000 lang. Okay, so that's 10,000 times 10% times the fair value at the date of declaration na 105. Kaya, we will be debiting the retained earnings at 105,000. Then, we will be crediting shared dividends distributable. Nabanggit kanina sa theoretical discussion that it should be recorded at the par value or the stated value. So, we will be crediting shared dividends distributable na yung 10,000 shares times 10% times yung par value kasi ni Shopao is 10%. So, 100,000. Now, meron talaga tayong excess dito which is 105. Okay, less 100. So, meron tayong credit na ordinary share premium na 5,000. So, that will be our entries on the date of declaration. Sir, on December 30, meron ba tayong magiging adjustments din sa retained earnings? No, wala ho. Kasi ulitin ko lang, walang effect yung any change in the fair values after nung date of declaration. Hindi kagaya ng property dividends na meron tayong effect pag nagbago yung fair value, no? Okay, this is already stock dividend, so wala. Wala tayong entry on the date of record. So on the date of payment, we just simply transfer it na debit tayo ng share dividends distributable, yung 100,000 kanina, and we credit ordinary share capital. So that's how it works for a small stock dividend. So let's now proceed naman sa isang large stock dividend. Nabanggit din kanina sa theoretical discussion that a large stock dividend will have 20% or more of the outstanding ordinary share non-declared. Okay, now, also, nabanggit na rin kanina na we will be recording it at par value. O kaya naman stated value if in that case, no? So, hindi kagaya ng small stock dividend, it's not complicated since we don't need any fair value. So, kapag nakita kayo ng large stock dividend, make sure na huwag nyo nang papakailaman yung mga fair value since we are not about to use it. Ang kailangan natin is yung par value or the stated value. Okay. So, in pro forma entries, so we will be debiting the retained earnings at the par value and credit share dividends distributable at par value. So, sa large stock dividend, wala na kayo makikita na share premium once declared. Okay? And then, on the date of distribution natin or date of payment, so ganun din, debit share dividends distributable and credit ordinary share capital. So again, clear yung distinction between the two small and large stock dividend. Aside from the percentages, aside from the fair value being recorded, kapag small, may share premium na on the date of declaration. Sa large stock dividend naman, walang share premium. Okay, so we're recording it at par value. So let's proceed with the example of a large stock dividend. So Shopao Corporation has 10,000 shares of 100 par value ordinary share capital outstanding as of December 1, 2019. On this date, the board of directors declared 30% stock dividend. So 30% means large stock na tayo, distributable to shareholders of record on December 30, 2019, payable on January 15, 2020. There are fair values, but remember na mention ko kanina that in a large stock dividends, fair value is to be ignored. Okay? So, we have 30%, so that's equivalent to 3,000 shares na madidistribute over those shareholders. So on the date of declaration, we will be recording debit to retained earnings 300,000 and credit share dividends distributable at 300,000. So it was computed based on the 10,000 shares times 30% or yung 3,000 na shares to be distributed times 100 peso na par value. Okay? So that's the entry on the date of declaration. Walang magiging effect ang fair value. Wala tayong recorded share premium. Okay? And then, on January 15, 2020, on the date of payment, simply debit share dividends distributable at 300,000 and credit ordinary share capital 300,000. So again, wala kayong nakitang share premium kapag large stock dividend. Okay? So, any question? So, take note importante ang tamang pag-identify whether large or small stock dividend siya. Okay? Again, to reiterate, small stock dividend will have a 10%, less than 20% ng ating outstanding shares. And then, kapag large stock dividend naman, it would be 20% or more ng ating outstanding shares. And the percentage is computed based on the number of shares declared over the number of outstanding shares, no? If the percentage is not actually given. So our last form of dividend is liquidating dividend. So this liquidating dividend is actually a return of capital to the investing shareholders and not a distribution of earnings. So the action to declare liquidating dividends is usually undertaken by the entities intending to cease operation or the entities engaged in mining. Okay, so technically again, so kapag liquidating, it's more likely to cease the operation na from those self-liquidating. Okay, now, ano yung mangyayari dito sa particular scenario na to? So it's just like you're still paying for a cash dividend, pero if you don't have enough retained earnings to provide for this declaration, then ang mangyayari pag liquidating dividend, the transaction is recorded by debiting an additional paid-in capital. So on the next slide, we will show kung ano yung entries related dito sa liquidating dividend. Paano siya naiba doon sa mga una nating na-discuss. So for our example of liquidating dividends, so assume that on January 31, 2020, the board of directors of Kikiam Corporation declares 4 million cash dividends to its ordinary shareholders. And as such, 1,000 of the dividends are liquidating. Okay? So sinabi na 1,000 yung liquidating. The balance of retained earnings on that date is 3 million. The dividends is payable on March 1, 2020. Remember ha na ang kabawasan natin sa retained earnings should only be up to the amount of retained earnings. Kaya later, magmamatter yung 3 million lang yung retained earnings mo at saka yung 4 million yung naging cash dividends. So, in the date of declaration, what will happen is we will be debiting the retained earnings by the 3 million amount, the balance. And then, since meron tayong 1 million liquidating dividend, at nabanggit ko kanina that liquidating dividend will be charged against the additional paid-in capital. So dito sa case na to, I debited ordinary share premium at 1 million and we credit cash dividends payable na 4 million. So nangyari kaya na-debit yung share premium, it's because it serves as a return on the investment now of a particular shareholders, no? So ngayon, yun yung pinagkaiba niya as the regular na cash dividend. Meron tayong na debit na ordinary share premium. Okay? Pero again, the intention of this liquidating dividend is usually for those companies that are already ceasing its operations. Okay, ngayon naman, on the date of payment, the same way, no, debit tayo ng cash dividends payable na 4 million and credit cash. So dun lang talaga tayo na iba sa date of declaration. As an additional discussion about dividends, okay? So this next slides are actually related sa cash dividends na discuss natin kanina. Pero yung cash dividends kanina kasi, it's more on one share lang yung napakita ko, no? Ngayon, ipapakita natin what if there are two classes of share, namely the preference and ordinary share, na kung saan nag-declare tayo ng dividends, okay? So when the total amount of cash is declared and paid as the amount distributed to the preference shares, so meron tayo at saka ordinary shares, meron po tayong order of priority in terms of the payment. No? Hindi pwedeng, okay. So, pwedeng mangyari kasi na, okay, ito yung para sa preference, pwedeng ito yung sa ordinary, pwedeng ganun yung mangyari sa problem given na. Pero in some other cases, the totality of the dividends declared talaga yung nangyayari. Tapos, hahatiin natin siya as to the preference and ordinary based sa mga magiging situations natin later. So, ito yung priority natin, no? Kapag ang isang preference share, so remember ha, ang preference share on our introduction of it states that it has a priority over the preference on the dividends as well as corporate liquidation. So dapat in cases na nag-declare ng dividend at there are preference and ordinary shares, unang babayaran ang preference shares. So in cases that the preference share is cumulative and there are dividend in arrears, so babayaran muna natin. So ano yung dividend in arrears? Na-mention na yan before na kung saan dividend in arrears are those dividends that are unpaid at the end of the period. Okay? Hindi pa siya nababayaran. O kaya naman, let's say for example, ganito, 2019, no? Walang naganap na declaration. Tapos cumulative yung preference share mo, entitled siya ng previous unpaid dividends. Tapos 2020 nag-declare ka. So dapat bayaran mo muna yung related sa 2019. So yun yung sinasabi na dividend in arrears on cumulative preference shares if any. Okay? Ngayon, kung wala namang dividend in arrears o kaya meron man dividend in arrears, the next would be the current dividend and preference shares. Ayan. meron ng current dividend ang preference share. So, nauuna pa rin siya. Tapos, after mo mabayaran yung related amounts to the preference share, saka pa lang tayo magbabayad ngayon sa ordinary shareholders. Okay? So, yan yung papakita natin later sa mga various scenarios na meron tayo in terms of our discussion. Also, these are items that we need to take into consideration aside from dun sa priority kanina ng payment of cash dividends as to the allocation of cash dividends as well as cash dividends to the preference share and ordinary shares. So when preference shares is cumulative, dividends not declared in a given year accumulate. So yun yung kaninang nabanggit natin na kapag accumulating or cumulative yung isang preference share. Okay, a non-cumulative preference share is not entitled to any accumulated dividends. So non-cumulative. Naalala ninyo before na kapag walang sinabi whether cumulative or non-cumulative, ang magiging assumption natin dyan would be non-cumulative. Okay? A participating preference share provides for additional dividends to be paid to its holder after dividends of a specified amount or rate are paid to ordinary shareholders. So, nung inintroduce natin yung tinatawag na participating preference share doon sa slide or sa PowerPoint 1 natin, part 1 of the shareholders equity. So a participating preference shares are those preference shares that are being entitled on the excess nung ating dividends being declared. Okay? Naalala niyo yon? It entitles the holder to the receipt of additional dividend after the holders of both preference and ordinary shares have been paid up to the current year's dividend. So, merong extra dividend kapag participating preference shares. So, later, we will have an example about participating. And lastly, kapag non-participating naman, it limits the dividends for the year to a specified dividend rate lang. Again, to recall the definition of a non-participating preference share, so it is a preference share which entitles the holders to the receipt of dividends up to the current period only. So, current period lang yung dividend na yan. So, please tandaan nyo to kasi later on, in terms of allocation, this is very important. So this example and this given capital structure, okay, will be our primary basis for our discussion in terms of allocation of cash dividends for both preference and ordinary shares. So please take note of this, the details. So the capital structure of Kwek Company is as follows, okay? So your preference share capital, take note, 10% yung kanyang rate. Ano nga ulit yung rate na yun? That's the dividend rate natin, okay? That's actually yung tinatawag natin na percentage dividend nung introduction ng cash dividend natin. Okay? 100 peso yung par and we have 10,000 shares. So, the preference share capital is at 1 million. Then, your ordinary share capital is 10 peso par. Okay? For 300,000 shares, which is a total of 3 million. Ngayon, ang na-declare daw na dividends for year 1 is only 90,000 and for year 2 is 600,000. So take note of this kasi magmamatter yung amount ng dividend declared kasi dyan lang yung amount na limit natin for the distribution. Okay? So annual dividend rate for the preference. So if we're going to compute for the percentage dividend ng preference, that's 10% ng 1 million natin. So 100,000. So take note 100,000 per year ang priority natin for the preference share. Okay, whether cumulative siya or non-cumulative kung merong na-declared na dividend. So please take note of this Okay, gagamitin natin siya sa mga susunod na mga slides. So we have the first assumption as to our example for the allocation of cash dividend to preference and ordinary shares. So we assume that the preference share is non-cumulative and non-participating. So non-cumulative, ibig sabihin, we are not entitled for any dividend in arrears or previously undeclared dividends, and non-participating meaning we will not get any excess. We can only get the current year's dividend. Okay, so kung naalala rin ninyo on the previous slide regarding Kwek Corporation, okay, so our preference share should receive 100,000. That's based on the 10% of the 1 million. However, in year 1, if you have remembered, 90,000 lang yung dineclare. So ngayon, in that case, no, yung buong 90,000 on this year 1, okay, will only go to the preference share. Bakit? Kasi actually kulang pa nga di ba? However, wala na tayong magagawa since that's only the amount being declared. So diyan napapakita yung power ng preference share na maging priority. Okay? So nabigay sa kanya lahat yung 90,000. Now what will happen to the excess of 10,000? Kasi 'di ba supposed to be 100,000 'yon. Okay? Our 10,000 will already be ignored. Bakit? Kasi non-cumulative yung preference share. Okay? So wala rin tayong ordinary share dividends na marireceive for year 1. Okay? So that's for year 1. Now for year 2, no? Okay? Ang dineclared na dividends ni corporation is 600,000. Okay, so meron na tayong enough, no, for preference and ordinary in this case. So wala ho tayong entitlement ulit for the previous year's dividend kasi non-cumulative tayo. So ang ibabayaran lang natin for preference is the full amount of 100,000 na dividend for that current year. Okay? So ngayon, lahat na ng excess ng 600,000 over doon sa 100,000 na yun will now be charged to ordinary. Okay? So, yung balance napunta tuloy sa ordinary. So, yun naman yung kagandahan. No? If it is non-cumulative, non-participating, any excess, lalo na kung malaki yung na-declare na dividend, will simply go to the ordinary after deducting the preference share dividends. Okay? So, as you can notice, 100,000 yung mapupunta sa preference share and then for the ordinary share is 500,000. Okay? Any questions? So that's if non-cumulative and non-participating. So mapapansin niyo importante ho yung pagtingin kung anong uri ng preference share ang meron tayo in order for us to allocate it properly. Now, let's proceed with the next assumption. So, we have naman preference share is cumulative. So, kung cumulative na siya, ibig sabihin, entitled na siya for previous undeclared dividend or dividend in arrears, but still non-participating. So, in year 1, same pa rin ho kasi kulang pa rin yung declared dividend over the 100,000. So, lahat pa rin ulit mapupunta sa preference share. But take note, kanina in assumption 1, dahil non-cumulative, we ignore yung 10,000 na kulang. Dito, for our assumption number 2, no, we have a dividend in arrears na, which will be paid for the next period if magkakaroon na ng payment. So, in year 2, as you can notice, yung 10,000 na kulang ng year 1, yun na ho ay unang babayaran natin. So, sa priority, any dividend arrears should be paid first. So, ayan. Now, tapos, since enough din naman ulit yung pambayad natin na dividends, ibibigay na natin in full yung 100,000 na current dividend ng preference share. Okay? Tapos, since 110 na yung napunta sa preference share, yung excess ng 600,000 over the 110,000 which is 490,000, yun na ngayon ay mapupunta sa ordinary share. So yun yung mangyayari kapag preference share is cumulative but non-participating. Since the preference shares are cumulative, they are entitled to the payment of dividend in arrears. However, since they are non-participating, they are not entitled for any dividends in excess of the current year's dividends. Okay? Any question? So to continue with our example, so we have assumption number 3 wherein preference share is non-cumulative, which means it is not entitled for any previous undeclared dividend or dividend in arrears, and fully participating. So yan naman yung bago ngayon, fully participating, which again means na entitled ang preference share to additional dividends after mabayaran yung regular dividends for both preference and ordinary shareholders. Okay. So sa year 1, wala ulit tayong problema since the 90,000 na na-declare is attributable lang talaga sa preference share kasi kulang pa nga siya, di ba? 10,000. So yung 10,000 na kulang in year 1, since non-cumulative ito, i-ignore ulit natin siya. Now, in year 2, we have again a total of 600,000 declared na dividend. So, in this allocation, ang mangyari, una, babayaran muna natin yung dividends for preference and ordinary based doon sa preferential rate na 10%. Okay, so unahin ko yung preference share, di ba? Ang annual dividend niya based on the 10% is 100,000. So, yun yung 100,000 na nasa preference under current dividends. Now, yung ordinary, since ito yung characteristic ng fully participating na nandito sa assumption 3 na wala sa assumption 1 and 2, okay, mabibigyan na rin agad si ordinary share ng dividends. Pero, it's only limited first doon sa 10% ng ordinary share capital. Okay? Sir, bakit ganon? Yun yung characteristic ng fully participating eh. Ibibigay mo muna sa preference and then another based on the ordinary share capital multiplied by the preferential rate ng preference share. Kaya 10% multiplied by the 3 million na ordinary share capital, that's 300,000. So mabibigyan na ngayon agad ng dividend yung ordinary share capital. So pag inad mo, yung 100,000 na binigay na sa preference at saka 300,000 na binigay sa ordinary share, that's a total of 400,000. Remember, yung ating total na dividends declared for the year 2 is actually to 600,000, no? So meron pa tayo excess na 200,000. Ngayon, ang mangyayari dun sa excess, since this is fully participating at allowed na makakuha ng excess si preference share, okay, so what will happen, yung 200,000 excess will be allocated based on the total par value. So kanina sa pinakaunang slide natin about Quick Corporation, no, our share capital for preference is 1 million and our share capital ordinary share capital is 3 million. So pag inad natin yon, 4 million yung totality na par value ng ating mga share capital. So, yun yung gagamitin natin for our allocation. So, sa preference, yung 200,000 excess times 1/4 lang nilagay ko dyan, but that's technically 1 million all over 4 million. Okay? Which will give you the allocation na ibibigay sa preference share of 50,000. Then, another allocation for ordinary share, okay, kasi meron din siya, 200,000 times 3/4, that's actually yung 3 million na ordinary share capital over the total share capital natin na 4 million, that's 150,000. So, ganyan yung mangyayari if our preference share is fully participating. Kaya ang naging total ng year 2 dividend for preference is inclusive of yung current dividend na 100,000 plus yung allocation ng excess na 50,000. So total 150,000. Okay? Yes? Then for the ordinary share naman, we have yung 300,000 based doon sa current dividend na 10% times 3 million plus yung allocation noong excess, which is 150,000. So 450,000 naman yung para sa ordinary. So yan yung, again, yan yung fully participating. So to summarize for assumption number 3, since the preference share are non-cumulative, they are entitled only for current year's dividend. Okay, so hindi sila entitled for any dividend in arrears. And since they are fully participating, they are entitled to additional dividends after payment of regular dividends to both preference and ordinary shareholders. The regular dividend in ordinary share is based on the dividend rate on preference shares. So yun yung kanina, no? The excess dividend is allocated proportionately to the two classes of shares based on their total par value. So that's our assumption number 3. For our next assumption, no, nasa assumption number 4 na tayo. So yung preference share naman is cumulative. So entitled na siya for any dividend arrears at saka fully participating. Okay. So sa year 1, wala ulit pagbabago since 90,000 ulit yung para sa preference share lang. Since this is cumulative, yung 10,000 na kulang in year 1 will be charged first in year 2. Kaya mapapansin ninyo that in year 2 na unang bayaran yung dividend in arrears natin. Okay, since again fully participating gaya nung ginawa natin sa previous slide na fully participating, no, binigyan natin yung preference and ordinary ng current dividend based on the preferential rate natin na 10%. So 100,000 ulit for the preference, and the ordinary will be having the 300,000 based on the par value of the ordinary share capital na 3 million times the preferential rate of 10%. And just like what we did kanina rin, no? We have allocated the remaining balance based on the par value or the share capital. Now, dito, ang excess na lang kasi natin is 190. Sir, bakit waging 190? Kasi we have 10 plus 100 plus 300. So that's a total of 410,000. Then ang dineclare na dividend for year 2 is 600,000. So 600 minus 410,000. So 190 na lang excess. Kanina kasi 200. Naging 200 yun kasi walang charging ng dividend in arrears. Dito ngayon sa assumption 4, we charge the 10,000 pesos na dividend in arrears. So again, to allocate for the excess, so it's based on the total par value of the share capital. So 190,000 times 1 million over the 4 million for the preference share, so that's 47,500. Then for the ordinary share capital naman, the 190,000 excess times the 3 million over the 4 million na allocation values natin, so that's 142,500. So if you add them all, so for the preference in year 2, makakakuha siya ng 157,500, and for the ordinary share capital, that's 442,500. Okay, any questions? So that's with the preference share is cumulative and fully participating, which, okay, to summarize, since the preference shares are both cumulative and participating, they are entitled to the receipt of dividend in arrears and also to the receipt of additional dividends after the regular payment of dividends to both preference share and ordinary shareholder. So for our last assumption, for our example of the allocation, okay, we have the preference share is also cumulative and participating up to an additional 4%. So technically, the preferential participation or the full participation rate of our preference share is up to 10% lang. But in this case, we have an additional as per statement na 4%. Now, who determines the additional participation? Of course, it's either indicated in the stock certificate o kaya naman it's either given by the stockholder as well. Now, in this process, no, medyo may sort lang ng pagkakaiba siya doon sa fully participating natin kanina. So let's show kung paano yon. So in year 1, we have the current dividend again of 90,000. So wala nang question. Throughout the 5 assumptions, 90,000 talaga year 1 will be allocated to the preference share. Now, again, since cumulative yung preference share natin, we will be giving the 10,000 pesos na kulang in year 1 first in year 2. Okay? Tapos, dahil participating ito, fully participating, with additional 4%, then we have the current dividend muna, which is based on the 10% na preferential rate natin. So, sa preference is 100 and 300. So, kanina, same lang din siya no nakaraan. Ngayon, kung maalala ninyo, kung fully participating lang, ang gagawin natin, yung excess will be allocated for both ordinary and preference share based doon sa ating par value of the share capital. But right now, we will be using the excess participation na 4%, okay, to allocate it, okay, using the par value. So, gagamitin natin yon. Okay, so what will happen here, we have 4% of 1 million, which is 40,000, then 4% of 3 million, which is 120,000. So, pag inad natin hanggang dun sa point na yon, no, yung na-distribute na natin sa preference and ordinary is a total of 570. Okay? So, 570. So, yung ating excess na ngayon would be 30,000 na lang. So, saan mapupunta yung excess? Hindi na ho natin siya hatiin for both preference and ordinary. So, yung excess ng 600,000 over what was being previously distributed na 570,000 ay ilalagay na lang natin ngayon sa ordinary share. Okay? So, ang total ngayon ng preference share for year 2 dividend would be 150,000 and for ordinary share year 2 naman would be 450,000. Okay? Clear? So now, I just put a notation. So may notation lang tayo dun sa allocation up to the limit of participation, no? Di ba, lahat-lahat, bago tayo maglagay ng balance to ordinary is 570. Okay, ang sinasabi lang dito, paano daw kapag less than 570? So, ibig sabihin, hindi natin mamimit yung requirement na 4% additional allocation ng preference at saka ng ordinary. So, if the dividends declared is less than 570, okay, the remaining dividends after the current dividend based on the stipulated rate is allocated proportionately between the preference and ordinary. So, ibig sabihin, yung 570 na up to the allocation on the limit, kapag hindi yun na-meet, okay, so, i-add natin yung dividend arrears plus current dividends, excess, di ba? Hindi na kayang sumapat doon sa 40 at saka 120 ng preference and ordinary. So, kung ganun yung mangyayari at hindi na sapat, well, babalik tayo sa kagaya ng assumption 4 na kung saan, i-allocate na lang natin yung excess using daw the preference and ordinary shareholders allocation natin kanina na par value. Okay? So, is that clear? Okay, so that's our allocation for the cash dividend. So just to summarize this particular situation on the on the cumulative preference share participating, again, since the preference share are participating up to a certain percent only, comparison should be made, okay, doon sa amount. Kanina kinompare natin, okay? So technically, okay, kailangan ninyong tandaan na kapag may additional participation, i-check ninyo kung enough pa yung natitirang balance or hindi so that you can still allocate the limit na additional participation. For our last part of this part 4's discussion, so let's talk about appropriation of retained earnings. Pero before we proceed, again, to define retained earnings, so our retained earnings is the portion of a corporate capital that represents the net accumulated profits after deducting the reported losses and distribution to shareholders, and it is also known as accumulated profit. So dito natin na-accumulate yung profit, yung mga other items na nagkaroon ng charging against this account. Okay? So, pero technically, the gain or loss. At dito rin natin kinukuha yung ating particular na dividends. So, the appropriation means that there is a portion of these retained earnings that is earmarked for a designated purpose and is unavailable for dividends. Okay? So, doon sa treasury share, kung naalala ninyo, meron tayo nabanggit doon about appropriation, no? So, kapag appropriated kasi ang retained earnings, it will be restricted for dividends. Kanina sa mga previous first part of discussion nitong ating PowerPoint, no, diniscuss natin, okay, pag may dividends, ito, debit to retained earnings at the date of declaration. Okay? So, nababawasan yung retained earnings natin. So, that is coming from an unrestricted or unappropriated na retained earnings. Pero kapag na-appropriate na siya, then it will not be available for dividends. Now, what's the reason? Bakit kailangan natin na mag-appropriate or bakit meron tayong restriction as to this retained earnings? So, you have three causes. No? Number one is legal requirement. So, appropriation of treasury shares as required under the corporation law. So, we need to appropriate because there are treasury shares, which is nadaanan natin last time, di ba? Okay, so that's the first reason bakit nag-appropriate. Another would be contractual arrangement or agreement. Okay? So appropriations for bond indebtedness as required under some bond indenture. So we have already discussed bonds before, no? So in some cases, no, that the management will have an appropriation for the bond for indebtedness para hindi magalaw. Maybe they will be using it for the sake ng payment in the future of this particular bonds, okay, as required by some bond indenture, then that's a contractual agreement, okay? And then we have discretionary action, okay? So the appropriation for potential future loss or loss contingencies or appropriation for plant expansion or even decided by management. So kung naalala niyo sa PPE dati, na meron kayong tinatawag na appropriated for plant expansion, discussion, okay, so that's technically somehow related as well to this appropriation of retained earnings. Pero please take note that appropriations does not affect the total retained earnings. So nagkakaroon lang tayo ng title na retained earnings, appropriated, unappropriated, restricted, unrestricted. Pero pag tinotal natin sila, it's still the same. Nagkakaroon lang ng distribution sa titles. And also the total stockholders equity hindi gagalaw. And also take note na ang retained earnings, it does not necessarily mean that it is a cash fund. So itong tatlong legal requirement, contractual agreement, at saka discretionary, even though they are being appropriated, it does not necessarily mean na meron na siyang equivalent cash na appropriation. Okay? So yun lang, yung kailangan nyo tandaan ha. Hindi po nagbabago ang retained earnings, ang total shareholders equity accounts natin kapag nagkaroon ng appropriations, at neither it does not also represent any cash fund.